Welcome to Wonderland Unlocked. I'm Courtney, a certified peer support specialist, and this is Series 2, Through the Rabbit Hole, the beginning of self-discovery. I've fallen down my own rabbit hole, questioning everything along the way. Now, I'm here to support you as you explore the unknown, challenge what you believe, and uncover who you really are. Take a deep breath. The rabbit hole is waiting. Let's unlock Wonderland together.
Alice, sweetheart, it's time for tea. Alice. Alice.
Welcome back to Wonderland Unlocked. In today's episode, Finding the Thread, Making Sense of the Madness, we're going to talk about one of the most transformative parts of self-discovery, finding the thread that weaves us through the madness. When we're in the midst of overwhelming chaos, it often feels like we're lost in the madness, unable to understand why things are happening or where we're headed. But what if I told you that there is always a thread, a connection between everything that happens in our lives, even the moments that seem random or senseless? That thread is what helps us make sense of the madness and navigate through it with clarity. Through this episode, I'm going to share with you some of my own personal stories, as well as the science behind how our brains work during times of chaos. And most importantly, how we can find that thread and use it to make sense of everything. I'll also be diving deep into a powerful tool I've discovered, the art of meaning making. Because as you'll hear, finding meaning in the chaos is often the key to unlocking the wisdom hidden in the madness. So let's go down the rabbit hole together. We've all been there, standing in the middle of what feels like an emotional storm. Life throws challenges our way, things don't go as planned, and suddenly we're caught in the middle of the madness. Everything is spinning, our thoughts are racing, and it's hard to find any sense of direction. It's like being in the eye of a hurricane, watching everything unravel around us while struggling to hold ourselves together. For me, chaos wasn't just a passing storm. It was my constant reality for years. I remember a time in my life when everything seemed out of control. My emotions were all over the place. One moment I'd feel intense joy. The next I'd feel a wave of sadness so deep it felt like drowning. It was as if I was being pulled in every direction at once, unable to catch my breath. The unpredictability of it all left me exhausted, confused, and wondering why I felt this way in the first place. I didn't realize at the time that this emotional roller coaster wasn't something I had to avoid or suppress. It wasn't a sign that something was fundamentally wrong with me. It was my brain reacting to stress, trauma, and emotional overload. But understanding that came much later. In those moments, I just felt broken. Like I was constantly failing at being, quote, normal. So, why does this happen? Why does it feel like our emotions take over when we need to stay calm the most? The answer lies in how our brain processes the information, especially when we're under stress. The human brain is designed for survival, and when we perceive danger, real or imagined, it activates our fight or flight response. This response is controlled by a small but powerful part of the brain responsible for processing emotions and detecting threats. When it senses something overwhelming, it essentially hijacks our prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain responsible for rational thinking, impulse control, and decision-making. Think of it like this. The prefrontal cortex is the rational, level-headed captain of the ship, steering us through life's challenges. But when a storm hits, when stress, fear, or intense emotion flood our systems, the other takes over, throwing the captain overboard. Suddenly, we're being tossed around by the waves, reacting instinctively rather than thinking clearly. This is why, in moments of emotional chaos, we might lash out, shut down, or make impulsive decisions we later regret. And here's the tricky part. Our brain doesn't differentiate between actual life-threatening situations and everyday emotional distress. Whether you're facing a real physical threat or simply feeling overwhelmed by emotions, it reacts the same way. This is why something as simple as receiving bad news, feeling rejected, or having a stressful day can trigger the same panic response as if we were in danger. When I first learned about this, something clicked. I had spent so much time blaming myself for my reactions, for the way my emotions felt uncontrollable, when in reality, my brain was just doing what it was wired to do. It wasn't a failure on my part. It was a survival mechanism that had gone into overdrive. But here's the good news. Just because it reacts automatically doesn't mean we're powerless against it. There are ways to regain control, to bring the prefrontal cortex back online, and to ride out the emotional storm without being consumed by it. Before we get into those strategies, though, we need to understand something even deeper: how the past experiences shape the way we respond to emotional chaos, and why some of us feel like we're constantly on edge, even when nothing is, quote, wrong. Because the truth is, chaos isn't just about what's happening in the moment. It's about everything that came before it. The experiences, the wounds, the unprocessed emotions that are all still living inside us. And that's what we're going to explore next. I remember one particular time when I felt completely lost. It wasn't just a passing moment of confusion. It was an all-consuming state of being. I was drowning in it. Life had become overwhelming, and no matter how hard I tried to regain control, it felt like everything was slipping through my fingers. Work was stressful. My personal life was in turmoil, and I couldn't get a handle on anything. I was exhausted, mentally and emotionally, but I kept pushing forward, convinced that if I just kept moving, if I just held everything together a little longer, I'd eventually find my way. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself unraveling. I remember feeling like I was walking in a fog, thick, suffocating, and endless. I couldn't see clearly. I had no sense of direction, and every step felt uncertain. It wasn't just one thing causing this chaos. It was the accumulation of everything. The stress at work, the emotional toll of relationships, and the personal insecurities I had buried so deep that I thought I had left them behind. But they weren't gone. They were right there, just beneath the surface, waiting for the cracks to widen so they could spill out. And that's exactly what happened. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was just tired, that I needed a break, that things would eventually get better if I just kept moving forward. But the truth was, I had no idea where I was going. I was aimless, drifting, waiting for something, anything, to pull me back onto solid ground. And in that aimlessness, I started making choices that weren't really choices at all. I let life happen to me instead of deciding what I wanted. I reacted instead of acted. And the more I let go of my own agency, the more lost I became. There was one night that sticks with me. I was sitting in my car after an especially long day, staring at the steering wheel, feeling completely disconnected from myself. I didn't even know what I was feeling. Sadness? Anger? Numbness? It was like every emotion had blurred together into a weight I couldn't lift. I wanted to scream, to cry, to do something to break the silence in my head. But I just sat there, frozen, staring at the dashboard as if the answers would magically appear in front of me. And that's when I realized something important. I wasn't just lost in the chaos. I was avoiding it. I was running away from the mess inside me, convincing myself that if I ignored it long enough, it would somehow fix itself. I distracted myself with work, with people, with anything that would keep me from sitting alone with my thoughts. But what I found was that the chaos didn't go away. It kept building up, growing heavier, pressing down on me until I had no choice but to face it. It wasn't until I started asking myself, what am I supposed to learn from this? That things began to shift. At first, I didn't have an answer, but I sat with the question anyway. And slowly, I started to see that the chaos wasn't just a mess. It was trying to tell me something. It was forcing me to look at things I had been avoiding, the parts of myself I had ignored, the pain I had refused to acknowledge, the fears I had let control me. I had spent so much time searching for something outside of myself to guide me, but the truth was, the thread I was searching for wasn't going to appear on its own. I had to seek it out. I had to be willing to sit with the discomfort, to unravel the meaning in the madness. And that was terrifying. Because when you finally stop running, when you sit down in the middle of your chaos and really look at it, you have to confront parts of yourself that you may not be ready to see. But I've learned something. Being lost isn't the same as being broken. And sometimes feeling lost is what pushes us to find ourselves in a way we never have before. It wasn't an immediate transformation. It was slow, messy, and filled with setbacks. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't just trying to survive the chaos. I was trying to understand it. And that changed everything. Because sometimes the only way out is through. Now, let's talk about meaning making. This is where we really begin to understand how we can find that thread, even the most chaotic moments of our lives. Meaning making is the process by which we make sense of events in our lives and connect them to a larger narrative. It's how we find purpose, even when everything around us seems random or senseless. It's what allows us to take pain, confusion, and hardship and turn them into something that we can learn from. When we're in the middle of chaos, our brain is craving meaning. We instinctively want to understand why something is happening, what it means, and how it fits into the bigger picture of our lives. But the thing is, meaning making is not always immediate. Sometimes it takes time. Sometimes we have to sit with the chaos and let it teach us before we can see its purpose. From a neurological perspective, our brain is wired to look for patterns. It wants to categorize experiences, make predictions, and create coherence out of what feels like randomness. This is part of our survival instinct. Our brain doesn't like uncertainty. When something unexpected or painful happens, the brain immediately goes into overdrive, trying to piece together a story that makes sense. This is where a concept called cognitive reappraisal comes in. The ability to change the way we interpret stressful or overwhelming events. Cognitive reappraisal is a psychological skill that allows us to shift our perspective on a situation, reframe it, and assign it a new meaning. Studies show that people who practice cognitive reappraisal are better able to cope with stress, regulate their emotions, and ultimately find meaning in even the most difficult circumstances. This is why two people can go through the exact same experience, but walk away with entirely different narratives about it. One person might see it as a tragedy that ruined their life, while another might see it as a turning point that led to growth. The event itself doesn't change, but the way we interpret it does. Think about a time in your life when something difficult happened. Maybe it was the end of a relationship, a major failure, or a moment when you felt completely lost. In this moment, it probably felt unbearable, like nothing good could come from it. But if you look back on it now, is there a lesson you took from it? Did it lead you to something new or shape you in ways you didn't expect? For me, when I look back at the chaotic period of my life, I can now see that it wasn't all bad. At the time, I felt like I was drowning in uncertainty. But in hindsight, I can recognize that it forced me to face parts of myself I had been avoiding. It shattered the illusion of control I was clinging to, and that shattering, painful as it was, became the very thing that allowed me to rebuild in a healthier way. The chaos became a teacher, and once I was able to step outside of my initial emotional reaction and look at it from a different perspective, I could reframe it from something that was happening to me to something that was happening for me. That shift in perspective didn't erase the pain, but it did help me move forward with purpose instead of just feeling like a victim of circumstance. The ability to reframe experiences is a skill we can all develop, and it's one of the most powerful tools for making sense of the madness. But it requires practice. Here are a few ways that we can strengthen this skill. Pause and reflect. Instead of immediately reacting to a difficult situation, step back and ask, what could this be teaching me? Even if the answer isn't clear right away, creating space for reflection helps rewire our brain to look for meaning instead of just reacting emotionally. Reframe the narrative. Try shifting your perspective from why is this happening to me to how can I grow from this? It's not about dismissing pain or pretending everything is positive. It's about giving yourself the power to shape the story. Look for patterns. Often, meanings makings happens when we start connecting the dots. If you faced similar struggles before, what did you learn from them? How did they shape the person you are today? Be patient. Some experiences take time to reveal their meaning. Just because you can't see it now doesn't mean it won't make sense later. Trust that clarity will come even if it's not immediate. Meaning making isn't about forcing ourselves to be okay with everything that happens. It's about recognizing that even in chaos, even in uncertainty, we have the power to shape how we interpret our experiences. And sometimes that makes all the difference. So how do we actually find that thread and begin to make sense of the chaos? Well, there are a few key coping skills that can help us through the process, and these are tools that I personally use to navigate some of the most difficult moments in my life. These skills don't always make chaos disappear, but they do help us find our bearings and move through it with more clarity and peace. The first skill is mindfulness. When everything feels chaotic, the best thing we can do is come back to the present moment. Mindfulness is like a grounding force. It pulls us back to the here and now, when our minds might be racing with a million thoughts about the future or the past. By focusing on the present, we break the cycle of overwhelm. I remember a time when I felt completely consumed by a stressful situation. Everything seemed to be spiraling out of control, and my mind was jumping from one worry to the next. In that moment, the last thing I wanted to do was slow down and focus on the present. But I forced myself to close my eyes and just breathe. I focused on the sensation of my breath, on the feeling of the ground beneath me, on the sounds around me. It was difficult at first, but after a few minutes, I felt a shift. The mental whirlwind slowed, and for a brief moment, I was able to step outside of the chaos and into a space of clarity. Mindfulness helps us step out of the mental whirlwind and become aware of what's happening around us. It's like finding an anchor when everything feels like it's drifting away. By focusing on the here and now, we can begin to untangle the web of thoughts and emotions that are keeping us stuck. It's not about forcing ourselves to feel calm or pretending the chaos doesn't exist. It's about creating space to just be with whatever is happening. The more we practice mindfulness, the more it becomes a tool we can use to shift our focus when the storm feels too intense. Another skill that's been incredibly helpful for me is journaling. Writing has been a lifesaver during some of the most overwhelming moments. When I'm in the middle of chaos, writing helps me process my thoughts and connect the dots between what's happening in my life. Sometimes when I look back at my journal entries, I see patterns and themes emerging that I didn't notice before. It's like finding the thread in the madness. It gives me a sense of clarity and direction. I remember a period in my life when everything felt like a blur. I was trying to juggle too many responsibilities and emotions, and I was struggling to make sense of it all. One night, I sat down with a pen and a blank page, not knowing what to expect. I started writing whatever came to my mind. My frustration, my fears, my confusion. As I wrote, I started to see a picture forming. There were patterns in the way I reacted to certain stressors, and I realized that my responses were rooted in fears I had been carrying for a long time. That realization gave me a sense of understanding that I had been missing. It helped me connect the dots between what was happening in my life and what was happening in my mind, and it gave me a sense of control. Journaling doesn't have to be complicated. You don't need to write a novel. or a book. Sometimes it's just about putting words on a paper to get your thoughts out of your head. Even if you don't feel like you have any answers, the act of writing can create space for those answers to emerge. Over time, I began to see journaling as a tool for self-reflection and discovery. It helped me find my thread in the chaos by giving me a clear picture of what was going on inside of me. And finally, self-compassion. This one is huge, and it's something I wish I had learned much earlier in my journey. In the midst of the chaos, it's easy to beat ourselves up, to feel like we're failing, or that we should be doing better. We tend to be our own harshest critic. I know I've often found myself thinking, why can't I just get it together? Why is it so hard for me? But when we approach ourselves with kindness and understanding, we allow space for growth. Instead of seeing chaos as something to fight against, we begin to see it as something we can navigate with patience and compassion. When I started practicing self-compassion, it was a game changer. I gave myself permission to feel what I was feeling without judgment. I allowed myself to be imperfect, to not have all the answers, and to make mistakes. The shift in mindset didn't mean I gave up or stopped trying. It meant I gave myself the grace to be human, and that made all the difference. I remember a particularly difficult moment when I was overwhelmed by feeling of guilt and shame. I had made a mistake at work and I was beating myself up over it, but I decided to try something different. Instead of staying stuck in self-criticism, I told myself, it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to not have everything figured out right now. That simple act of self-compassion softened the harshness of my thoughts and allowed me to move forward without feeling burdened by shame. By practicing these coping skills, we begin to uncover the thread that ties everything together. We start to make sense of the madness, and in doing so, we find a sense of peace and clarity. These tools aren't quick fixes, and they don't erase the chaos overnight. But over time, they help us build resilience, patience, and self-awareness. They teach us how to navigate life's storms with a sense of direction. And ultimately, they help us find the meaning in the madness. One final thought I'll leave you with. Sometimes, finding the thread isn't about solving all the problems at once. Sometimes it's simply about having the courage to show up for ourselves in the midst of the chaos. And that, in itself, is an act of growth. I'll never forget the moment when I first began to see the thread in my own life. It wasn't an overnight transformation. It was gradual, like the slow unraveling of a tangled knot. For the longest time, I felt like I was just drifting, reacting to life instead of actively shaping it. But one day, I looked back and realized that everything I had gone through, all the chaos, was leading me somewhere. At the time, I couldn't see it. I was consumed by frustration, by disappointment, by the overwhelming sense that I had lost my way. I had spent years chasing external goals, believing that if I just reached a certain milestone, achieving a certain level of success, or gained the approval of others, then I would finally feel fulfilled. I thought that meaning existed somewhere outside of me, something I had to find or earn. But when everything fell apart, when I lost the things I thought defined me, I was left with nothing but myself. And that terrified me. Because if I wasn't my achievements, if I wasn't the roles I played in other people's lives, then who was I? And in that stillness, that inescapable confrontation within myself, that I started to understand the real meaning was never in the external things. It was in how I responded to life's challenges. It was in the way I chose to interpret my experiences, the lessons I pulled from them, and the person I became because of them. That moment of clarity didn't come as some grand epiphany. It was a quiet shift, a realization that settled into my bones. I didn't need to have all the answers. I didn't need to control everything. Instead, I could just trust the process. I could trust myself. And as I embraced this new perspective, I started to see that the chaos wasn't my enemy. It was my teacher. It had been teaching me all along, even when I didn't want to listen. It pushed me to uncover strengths I didn't know I had. It forced me to let go of illusions that were holding me back. It taught me resilience, patience, and the courage to keep going even when I couldn't see the road ahead. That's the thread. It's the connection between every experience, every challenge, and every lesson learned. It's what helps us find meaning in the madness. And here's the most important thing I've learned. The thread is always there, even when we can't see it. Even in the moments when life feels like complete chaos, when nothing makes sense, the thread is quietly weaving itself through our story. We may not recognize it in the moment, but when we look back, we start to see how every moment, every triumph, every heartbreak, every mistake was part of something bigger. Finding clarity in the chaos doesn't mean eliminating uncertainty. It doesn't mean everything suddenly becomes easy. It means learning to trust that even in the mess, even in the unknown, we are still moving forward. The story is still unfolding, and we are the ones who get to decide what meaning we make of it. So, as we wrap up today's episode, I want to leave you with this. The madness of life isn't something we need to escape from. It's something we can learn to navigate. Every chaotic moment holds within it the potential for growth and understanding. When we embrace the chaos, when we find the thread, we unlock a deeper sense of the meaning and purpose in our lives. The storm might still rage around us, but with the right tools and mindset, we can weather it with grace. Thank you for joining me today on Wonderland Unlocked. I hope this episode has given you a new perspective on how to make sense of the madness and find the thread that connects everything. Until next time, remember to stay grounded and trust the process. Your thread is waiting for you.